Good evening, this is Carlos. This is my video presentation for our final class, or final paper for Dr. Nordstrom's class for the spring of 2015 for our finance class. What I focused on was kind of what we studied the last part of the class as far as stadium finance. So I started off talking about the economic downturn and how states, cities, charities didn't have as much money to dole out post 2007, and how, for instance, universities were cutting programs. A lot of, as we studied, as we read, a lot of even pro sports organizations or leagues went out of business as well. So then I started off with that, and then I went into the the four different stages or eras of funding. So as we know, the civic development era, and then the public subsidy era, and the transitional era, and then as we have now come to present day, the fully loaded private-public era, or the joint conjoining of those two. So I went over those a little, and then talked about how stadiums or how owners threaten to leave, or how they have threatened to leave. And as we learned, in order to fund these, we need to do studies to see if they're viable, to see if the rate on return is really a good deal, as we all know as well. So so then I went into the five different items that we learned about with Dr. Nordstrom, and we studied for, I believe it was chapter 5, and that long PowerPoint that we went over, and items such as when we learned about people moving, like somebody working in Kansas City, Missouri for the Chiefs, but living in Kansas, the state of Kansas. So it's two different things. That money doesn't stay in the state of Missouri; it goes to the state of Kansas. As Dr. Nordstrom's example of somebody with Spokane, working in Spokane, but going to Post Falls or whatever, Idaho. So talked about that, and then talked about just the pitfalls and how of course, the government entities or the city entities are going to make it more rosy or better than it really is. So talked about how we need to really be informed consumers, and how we really need to take a look, use the examples of the Yankees, and how the Yankees were never going to leave, as we learned about from that Democracy Now! Segment. The Yankees would have never left New York, because, as the one author said, the Yankees aren't the Yankees. They're not the billion-dollar Yankees in Charlotte, North Carolina. And just how there's other collateral damage. So I talked about that as well, how there's collateral damage that we don't think about. So for instance, the park being moved in that example, and another example that I read, a journal that I read, with the city of Arlington and Brooklyn Nets when they came in. So the people that were living there, there's a big gentrification. So the people that are living there are doing business owners. A lot of times their property is taken by eminent domain, but just that in of itself is an extra cost and unforeseen cost that the taxpayers are having to foot, because of course it goes through litigation, and the city has to pay for that, and then the city has to buy them out at fair market value. And then that's on top of that, once the new stadium's there, for instance in Arlington with the Cowboys Stadium, that is money that the city will never see back in taxes, because oftentimes those new stadiums are tax-free, or they don't have to pay taxes on the land. So for instance, if it was a Dell computer that made their new home there, or Schwinn bicycles, or whatever it may be, that is a private business that would have to pay taxes on that. And ironically enough, the Cowboys and the Nets are a private business. The only, obviously, as we know, publicly owned team is the Green Bay Packers in all professional sports. So kind of went into that area as well, and then talked about how a lot of times, even though the teams say they need the money, they don't, and then went into the example of the Miami Marlins that we studied as well. So the fact that they didn't need the money, they wouldn't open up their books, and I think that should be a requirement for future people needing monies, or future teams, because these teams are worth millions of dollars, in some cases billions, and the owners are millionaires, in some cases billionaires, as the Cowboys owner is, and as the Yankees are as well. So that's an interesting fact as well. How do we decide who gets it and not? And I would say still post 2007, even though the economy has bounced back, we still haven't gained back the 8 million jobs, and we probably won't. Or those jobs will be, the ones that were lost in those sectors will never be back in those sectors. the average family is still not making what they made before that. So my point is that we could use those monies better spent elsewhere, whether it's in charity work or in infrastructure, schools, firefighters, police officers, and a lot of times, most times, the lowest of the economy or the lowest of the citizenry will not be able to afford a ticket, as they pointed out, to New Yankee Stadium, new Cowboy Stadium, whatever it may be. The Minnesota Vikings building their new one in Levi Stadium out in Santa Clara. So that was kind of interesting as well. And then I went into the fact that people or government entities or city council people, mayors say, well, this is good because if we build these stadiums, it'll create job growth. But oftentimes, as we've learned, the job growth is temporary, or once it is started, it's a part-time job, not a full-time job. So that was the main focus. Just how do we decide who gets the money? And in my opinion, from everything I've read and studied and what I tried to lay out, the case was that we shouldn't be giving these owners any money. I mean, they're billionaires; they can afford it. And if they threaten to leave, I mean, again, the Cowboys were not going to leave. The Vikings, I can't foresee leaving Minnesota. That's their biggest fan base. I mean, nobody else is going to be a Vikings fan outside of Minnesota that heavily. So that was kind of the big picture of the paper. And just again, that we need to analyze everything, and we need to analyze who it really helps and who it doesn't help. So thank you so much. I've had a great time this semester, and of course, loved reading everybody's replies and responses. And thank you for everybody who replied and responded to my previous discussion post as well. And we're almost done, if we can believe that. So we've worked together hard, and I hope we all keep in touch after this.